Hi, welcome to EPG Pathshala. My name is Lalit Kumar. I teach English at Deen Dayal Upadhyay College, University of Delhi. The title for today's lecture is Criticism in Classical Antiquity, Longinus and Horace. So first, I begin by introducing you to the idea of criticism in the classical Greece or in the Greco-Roman culture, before I move on to the larger context of Greco-Roman literary criticism, Greco-Roman history, and I talk about Horace and Longinus. The word criticism comes from the Greek term krisis, K-R-I-S-I-S, which meant separation, selection, and judgment. Then, since the inception of literature and literary criticism, the readers needed to select from a plethora of plays and poetry available to them. The bad poetry that could have potentially a moral impact on the readers was to be separated from the good poetry. Plato, as you know, Plato is celebrated as the first critic in the entire history of Western literature. Plato, initially, he was the one who did the job of separating the chaff from the grain, or good poetry, quote unquote, from the bad poetry, quote unquote, and argued that in the ideal republic, children should hear only good fables, not the bad ones. In fact, it was Plato in whom we find for the first time a trenchant critique of the anthropomorphism of gods, something that was initially championed and institutionalized by the likes of Homer and Hesiod. And Plato was against the anthropomorphism of gods, or attributing human qualities to gods. In the classical Greece, the great Dionysia, a state festival held every spring in honor of the god Dionysius, was called or was understood as the public face of criticism. On the occasion of this very festival, comedies and tragedies written by Aeschylus, Aristophanes and others were performed with the objective of providing amusement and instilling patriotism and other virtues into the audience. Emergence of tragedy and comedy then can be seen as the state-sponsored dramatic festivals. One can argue then that creativity and criticism, since their inception, have been deeply embedded within each other, and it can be analyzed, it can be examined and understood not only by looking at the great Dionysia, the public face of criticism, but also by examining the first text of Western literature, that is Homer's The Iliad and the Odyssey. As we know, Homer, as the fountainhead of European literature, begins his epic in medias res. And while doing so, he set a precedent for the subsequent epic poets like Virgil, Milton, and others who chose to imitate Homer and begin their epic in medias res, that is in the middle of things. And later on, much later, Horace, in the 1st century AD, in his much celebrated book on literary criticism called Ars Poetica, commends Homer for beginning his epic in the middle of things. One can argue then that in Homer, one can find the epicenter of classical literary criticism or criticism of Greco-Roman culture, as the subsequent generation of critics seem to be divided over whether they would like to praise Homer or condemn him. As we know, Homer was criticized by the likes of Plato, who wanted to banish poets on the one hand, and on the other hand, critics like Longinus and Horace found in Homer the perfect model of imitation for the subsequent generation of critics and poets. Before I go back to Homer, let me introduce the readers to the Greco-Roman history or Greco-Roman literary culture, especially the two major critics this paper is primarily concerned with. So let me begin by introducing the students to Roman history or history of Roman literary culture. The two critics which we are concerned with in this paper, Longinus and Horace, they belong to classical Rome. The conventional classification of Greco-Roman literary history includes Archaic Age from 776 BC to 479 BC, Classical Age from 479 BC to 323 BC, Hellenistic period from 323 BC to 31 BC, and Roman or Latin literature from 31 BC to the 4th century AD. Now, the classification of literary or historical periods are artificial constructions and at times arbitrarily done after the event, for it is impossible to draw a neat dividing line between these historical or literary periods which flow into each other. So, these periods should not be treated as a sacrosanct categories, but as tentative categories which historians developed in order to make sense of the history. Roman literature supposedly begins in 31 BC, the year in which the combined forces of Octavius Caesar and other allies ended up defeating the combined forces of Antony and Cleopatra in the Battle of Actium. The Augustan Age, which is named after Augustus Caesar. Augustus was a title bestowed on Octavius Caesar later by the Roman Senate. The Augustan Age is also called the Golden Age of Latin literature, because it is during this very age that Rome emerged as the cultural as well as the political capital of the Greek world. So at one point of time, in ancient times, in ancient Greece, Athens was the center of cultural and political excellence. Later on, Alexandria became the center of cultural excellence, followed by Rome. Rome emerged as a center of military and cultural might during the reign of Augustus Caesar. Now here I am primarily concerned with the literary culture of Augustan Rome, which comprised Horace, Virgil and Ovid. On the one hand, the emperor Augustus Caesar extended his patronage to Horace and Virgil, and on the other, Ovid was someone who was subjected to his wrath, who was subjected to his anger. Paradoxically or ironically, Horace had begun his professional career as a soldier by fighting against Octavius Caesar in the Battle of Philippi in 42 BC. But once Octavius Caesar emerged victorious in that battle, he granted general amnesty to Horace and all others who had fought against him. And later on, Horace shifted to Rome and he befriended one of the close associates of Augustus Caesar called Maecenas. And it was Maecenas who had provided Horace the Sabine farm, which Horace meticulously celebrates in his satires. In his satires, Horace also celebrates what later historians have called New Pax Romana, that is, newly found Roman peace brought by Augustus Caesar. We know that Horace was primarily known for producing satires, epistles and ars poetica, that is art of poetry, which was a major work of literary criticism written in the form of a letter, written in the form of an epistle. So let's begin by looking at his satires first. His satires are characterized by self-reflexivity and allusion or topical allusion to his own times. We know that Lucilius, who was the immediate predecessor of Horace, was the founder of satire, and the Roman thinker, Roman critic Quintilius finds satire to be of purely Roman origin. So Horace basically in his satires celebrates New Pax Romana, and this is something that he could do because of the constant patronage that he enjoyed extended by Augustus Caesar. But in his satires he also exposes the follies of his contemporaries and predecessors. In Book 1, Satire 1, Horace lambasts or criticizes a sense of universal dissatisfaction that people feel with their existing job, existing professions. And he argues that a farmer wants to be a soldier wants to be a trader wants to be a lawyer, and a lawyer wants to be a trader. But if the god appears before them and wants to grant them their wish, they will disappear immediately. And that's the sense of universal dissatisfaction that Horace captures in his satires, apart from celebrating the new Pax Romana. The sense of playfulness and nonchalance that Horace demonstrates in his satires cannot be carried forward by another practitioner of Roman satire, Juvenal. Because Juvenal's times also is characterized by the decline of Greco-Roman culture, which happened because of the rise of tyrants like Nero and Tiberius on the one hand, and the rise of Christianity on the other hand, which happened in the 4th century AD when the Roman Emperor Constantine embraced Christianity. Now, Juvenal, who is considered to be another major practitioner of satire, he argues that his satires were characterized by indignation or anger. Writing in Satire 1, he says, and I am quoting Juvenal, that though nature forbids it, anger or indignatio is the Latin term that he uses. Indignatio constitutes my verses. And later on in Juvenal Satire 3, his protagonist, his mouthpiece Umbricius, thinks that Rome has been reduced to a place where only whores, intermediaries, sycophants, and panderers can thrive, not an honest person like Umbricius or Juvenal, as honest persons in Rome had no avenue to achieve upward mobility. So Rome, which was celebrated by Horace and Virgil at one point of time as the center of cultural excellence, has become culturally impoverished. It becomes culturally impoverished in the time of Juvenal. But again, we know, as I argued earlier, that Horace could successfully celebrate new Pax Romana or Roman peace only because of the patronage that was extended to him by Augustus Caesar and his associate Maecenas, something that could not be done by Ovid, as we know that Ovid was someone who incurred emperor's wrath and he was banished to the Black Sea in 8 AD for producing poems like Ars Amatoria, that is art of love, Amores, that is love, and Remedis Amores, that is cure of love. Augustus Caesar was someone who wanted to restore Rome to old style morality, and for that he brought a legislation outlawing adultery. Prior to that, adultery was not a criminal offense against the state. It was considered to be a private affair, a private matter. But once this legislation was brought outlawing adultery, it was declared to be an offense against the state. And in that background, in that volatile context, Ovid ended up producing poetry which focused on questions like how to seduce an attractive man or woman, or how to get rid of an old lover when you are tired of her or him. So these themes must have infuriated the emperor, who eventually decided to banish Ovid. But unlike Ovid, Virgil and Horace were the ones who enjoyed the state patronage, and Horace continued to celebrate new Pax Romana or new Roman peace in his satires. Now here we are primarily concerned with another important work written by Horace, and that is considered to be one of the classical works of literary criticism, that is Ars Poetica or Art of Poetry. Now Ars Poetica is often celebrated and cited for producing a monumental sentence, and that is, the aim of poetry is primarily to instruct and to please. And if we look at the entire history of literary criticism before and after Horace, we see critics, intellectuals and thinkers are divided over this issue. Some have argued that the aim of literature is to instruct, some have argued that the aim of literature is to please, and some have tried to reconcile these two seemingly opposite stances, something that Horace did successfully in his Ars Poetica. For instance, if we look at the condition of literary criticism in the 19th century England, we realize that someone like Matthew Arnold argues in his work Culture and Anarchy, and later on in his seminal essay The Study of Poetry, that the aim of poetry is to instruct, a stance which is immediately rejected by the adherents of art for art's sake in general, and Oscar Wilde in particular, who in his preface to Picture of Dorian Gray writes that all art is quite useless. So this is how Horace for the first time did a commendable job of reconciling these two seemingly role of poetry. So Horace in his Ars Poetica and in his satires primarily responds to two questions which have fascinated literary critics since antiquity. One is what constitutes great poetry, as according to Horace, great poetry should have the ability to combine these two seemingly opposite roles of literature which I just discussed. And another factor that he focuses on is how to counter the impact of market on poetry, how to counter the impact of market on art. Horace writes in Ars Poetica and also in his satires that he writes poetry, he produces satires not for consumption. His poetry was primarily written not for public consumption but for circulation among his friends. And this is a question which Longinus too continues in another major work on literary criticism called On the Sublime. On the Sublime, a major treatise was written by Longinus in the 1st century AD. Longinus too, like Horace, responds to two major questions. One, what constitutes great poetry? And second, how to counter the impact of market on poetry. If for Horace, great poetry should instruct and please, for Longinus, great poetry should be sublime. Now Longinus responds to two major questions. One, what constitutes the sublime? And second, what is sublime? So these are the questions that he tries to respond to in his major treatise called On the Sublime. Yes, for Longinus, there are primarily 5 sources of sublimity: great thoughts, overwhelming emotions, certain figures of speech, noble diction, and dignified word arrangement. And Longinus, unlike his predecessors and contemporaries, argued that by practicing these 5 qualities, the sublime too can be taught. As his predecessors and contemporaries argued earlier that sublime is innate, it cannot be taught. So as far as the teachability and unteachability, quote unquote, of the sublime is concerned, Longinus argued that it can be taught by the great minds, it can be cultivated by the great minds. And Longinus also develops the model of illustrative passages which he cites as the examples of sublime, and he cites those examples from Homer, Sappho, and Plato. In Sappho, Longinus argues that the syntactic disorder which is caused by the pangs of love felt by the poetic self of Sappho for the goddess Aphrodite causes sublime. It becomes both a cause and a product of sublime. So in Sappho, if it is the overwhelming emotion which causes sublime, then in Homer it is the representation of the wrath of God which produces terror first in the heart of the readers, and terror produces sublime. And we know much later, writing in the 18th century, when Burke produces his treatise on the sublime, he argued there categorically that sublime produces terror and terror generates pleasure. Terror becomes a source of delight for readers, a stand that he develops from Longinus, that he carries forward from Longinus. Now Longinus, in a way, he carries forward the critique, the trenchant critique of the anthropomorphism as championed by Homer. He carries forward the trenchant critique of Plato of the anthropomorphism of gods as institutionalized by Homer and Hesiod. Longinus writes that Homer, in his representation of gods, shows them fight, conspire like human beings. So Longinus writes that Homer reduces his gods to men and elevates his men to gods. That is one of the major contributions of Longinus to literary criticism, where he carries forward Plato's critique of Homer. Longinus is also known for developing the idea of universality, as according to Longinus, while addressing the question how to judge or how to distinguish a true work of sublime with false sublime, one can argue or one can implement the test of universality. According to Longinus, if a work of art pleases all the readers equally and elevates the minds of the readers, then it's a true work of sublime. We also know that for the adherents of modern theory, for the practitioners of quote-unquote literary theory with capital T, the idea of universality may not be so appealing. Nevertheless, we know that the subsequent generation of critics and literary thinkers, and not necessarily the adherents of literary theory like Burke, Kant and Zizek, all of them have been inspired by Longinus' theory on sublime, and they have tried to develop it further. To conclude, both Longinus and Horace agree that commerce corrupts poets and playwrights alike. However, they disagree on the issue of countering the impact of market on poetry. Horace advises poets to master technical perfection in poetry, whereas Longinus asks them to aim for the greatness of thought, which is both a cause and effect of the sublime. One example of what the excessive greed for money can do to poets in poetry comes from a 4th century BC poet Coriolus. It is said that Coriolus was promised a gold coin for each good verse that he produced and a beating for each bad verse that he wrote, and eventually he was flogged to death. This is what the greed for money could do to poets in the classical Greece as well. But at the same time, we also know that now we are living in the age of bestsellers. So in the age of bestsellers, it is difficult to negate or reject the impact of market on poetry altogether. Nevertheless, both Longinus and Horace, or reading Longinus and Horace, gives us new ways of countering to some extent the impact of market forces on poetry, as their work can be celebrated or can be seen as a work of prescriptive criticism. I am using the word prescriptive criticism in the sense that both of them primarily tried to respond to two major questions. One, what constitutes greatness in poetry and how to cultivate greatness in poetry, and second, how to counter the impact of market forces on poetry, something or the two questions which critics and intellectuals have grappled with since antiquity. Now let me conclude the entire presentation by telling you what students have learned from this module. All of us know that Plato is the fountainhead of literary criticism in a similar fashion, or similarly as Homer is celebrated as the fountainhead of European literature or Western literature. So Plato is where Greco-Roman literary criticism begins with. We know that Plato celebrates Socratic dialogue in his works, but Socrates was someone who never wrote a sentence, because either he was not familiar with the art of writing, or the art of writing was a newly acquired technique in the days of Socrates. We know that the art of writing was invented in the 8th century BC Greece. So in the time of Socrates, the art of writing may not be so popular. So Plato is someone who is celebrated as the first critic in the history of ideas, and Plato came up with an ethical role for poetry. and those who could not contribute to this ethical function of poetry were to be banished according to Plato. So if Plato is primarily concerned with the ethical role of poetry, then Aristotle was concerned with management of emotions in his work, mainly poetics. So Plato and Aristotle represent the initial major critics. Sorry, just we need to remove this sentence. Yes, could you please remove this sentence, the previous sentence where I was saying that Plato and Aristotle represent. So Plato and Aristotle represent the early trend of ancient classical criticism. And after discussing Plato and Aristotle, we also discussed Longinus and Horace, as these two represent two major historical junctures in the history of literary criticism, and they are relevant even today as they help us address some of the fundamental questions related to literature, related to art, related to poetry, and they also help us explore the relationship between poetry and market forces on the one hand, and poetry and power on the other. As we have seen in the example of Ovid, how he could not fashion his own self, his own poetry in relation to the empire, in relation to the state, and eventually he was banished. Thank you so much.